Welcome to Krachtwerken. So I was really interested in how the TransTube technology works. So I made a quick Google yesterday and I found a PDF that was published by Peavey, and I'll link to it below because I found it really interesting. I was always under this impression that it was just like a little piece of circuitry in the end that kind of mimics tubes and stuff. But actually reading through the article, this was actually years of kind of development and evolution. And it is a whole series of things inside the amp which tries to emulate the effects of having tubes. It even goes as far as the whole reaction from the kind of voltage feedback that you get from the speaker. So I thought I'd just make a quick video, try and explain how little shitty I understand it, but actually the point is to kind of point you to the PDF below for those nerds and geekoids out there. To this day, I still feel like if somebody says, oh, I want a good amp, or I want a practice amp, or I want something roadworthy that I can just throw around but sounds amazing, something I can pick up anywhere, I still think by miles the banded range is one of the best options. So anyway, so I'll try and explain a little bit what I have learned in my very, very, very feeble, technically minded brain. So to try and the design of a solid state amp and a tube amp is entirely different. There are lots of things that happen in a tube amp which does not happen in a transistor style amp and a solid state amp, and all of these factors together is what creates this difference. So according to the PDF, what they did was they kind of mimicked a lot of things that happen in a valve amp that gets you to a certain place. For example, it starts all the way from the preamp, having asymmetrical clipping happening in the preamp section, which kind of doesn't really happen in a solid state. Now, they do say in the PDF that some solid state amps kind of try to get to a tube sound by asymmetrically clipping the preamp section on the overdrive, but it's not enough. So TransTube went further. So firstly, they asymmetrically clipped the preamp section through the valves. They also asymmetrically clipped the power section, so that basically the same idea as if you are driving a tubes into saturation, and then it creates this kind of asymmetrical clipping. So apparently, according to the PDF, which is really interesting, it's quite in depth, and it talks about the fact that power tubes don't really asymmetrically clip until they are saturated. And it also talks about the fact that it is not the fact that tubes soft clip that creates the warm sound, but it's actually the asymmetrical clipping. So if you really oversaturate power tubes or tubes in general, they will also hard clip, and that's not really the difference. The other thing that they, I don't want to say mimic because it sounds wrong in the TransTube thing, because it's not like, fair enough, the PDF is written by themselves, and obviously there's a lot of bias in them, probably even a lot of kind of PR talk in it, but most of it makes sense. And it was also found, the link to it that I found was actually in a forum of a bunch of gurus who were kind of dissecting it a wee bit and talking about how it's a little bit PR, but overall it does sound right. Anyway, so a lot of the stages in the tube amp have been recreated And also it's really important that in the Transtube technology, nothing is digital. It's all done with clever circuitry. They even talk about how they recreate this kind of the difference between a solid state amp and a valve state amp of the feedback that comes from the speaker, because as the speaker moves from the electrical impulses from the amp, from the power amp, it essentially, because it moves within a coil, it also creates its own current and it goes back into the amp. And that is how presence and things like that are created in amps. And so if you turn up the presence, it's usually feeding back that that backward kind of voltage back into the loop. So they've recreated that as well. And then they're also talking about the T dynamics, and they were trying to explain that the T dynamics, or the tube dynamics, or whatever they want to call it, this dial that you have here is not a power attenuator. It is a power attenuator in the sense that it limits the amount of current that would, in inverted commas, flow to the tubes, which would essentially mean that they saturate earlier. The less voltage, the quicker they saturate, the less headroom you've got. So there's a whole bunch of stages in the Transtube thing that they have recreated through circuitry and obviously not digitally. And therefore, it's a more convincing kind of modeling. And that's another thing they say, it's not modeling. Recreating through circuitry, whatever. They also talk in the PDF about how they did a blind test with Studio Gurus and how none of them picked the Bandit out or the Transtube amp out as the solid state, but they actually chose another one, all 10 of them, essentially claiming that they fooled good ears. I find this very interesting. I wish I understood more about the circuitry, but to the guys out there who actually give a shit, there is a PDF which I will put down in the bottom. So on the amp itself, most people who watch this probably want to get a Transtube or already have one. But you've got cool sections. I mean, you've obviously got your clean and your drive section. And in your drive section, you've got the thrash setting, which is kind of like, sounds a bit just like a bit scooping a bit, and it gives a little bit more gain. You've got effects and return loops both, send and return loops both in the front and the back, which I find extremely convenient. You've got effects level kind of attenuated by just a button. And you've got a resonance, and that's another thing. So there's two things that come feeding back. One is the resonance, and one is the more kind of full-bodied high end that comes back, which is the presence, both of which you have some control over. So the resonance you can switch in and out, and the presence you actually have a dial. And in the dynamics, you've got full dynamics, and then you kind of turn down, from what I understand, mimicking the amount of power that goes in the tube. So if I understand this correct, it's the same idea as if you want to play metal, you need a clean a power section, and that's why metal amps tend to be 100 watt, 120 watt, so that you get your distortion and all that from your preamp, but you don't want to oversaturate your power amps, because then it's just going to get muddy and you don't have that tight bottom end. However, if you go down to like 50 watts or 20 watts or 30 watt amps, you've got less tubes. By using the volume, you drive the power tubes much faster and kind of use up all the headroom. So you get into the power tube distortion much earlier, which means that you can crank up the amp at a slightly low volume with a low wattage tube amp. And this is what I understand what they're trying to mimic here. So you're not actually lowering the volume or anything like that. You are basically lowering the voltage that would have come to the plates on the power tubes, and thereby allowing that kind of tube saturation tone to come in much earlier. Now, what I've noticed is that it doesn't really happen unless you're in the gain channel. I can't really hear it. I don't know if it's my ears that are not picking it up, but So I'm just gonna fuck around with this amp a wee bit while you guys watch. By the way, I am miking this up from a slight distance. I actually spent a bit of time this morning trying to get this mic position to such an extent where it kind of picks up what I pick up, but it's not 100% perfect. And then there's another one that comes out, another pickup that goes out to the from the power amp straight into a DI and into the interface. And I've applied one of my IRs to it, and when you hear this, I might have blended them, I don't know yet. But the point is that I want to try and do this amp justice. I don't want to kind of make it sound good or bad. I want to try and make it sound the way I hear it from, like, you know, a meter and a half away, kind of like not on the floor where you kind of only get the bassiness, but actually this is fairly ear level here. Okay, so let's use the amp's own distortion. So the setting I'll use is the gain setting here. Extra gain. I'm not gonna, well, I might put the thrash on, but let's get a bit of warmth in there. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you and show you some diaries because I've got nothing better to do this morning. If you would like to support this kind of shit, please, you know what to do. There's links below to help me have fun with this stuff. Good night. Thank you.